Nobody was supposed to find this.
She was handed a contract before they ever shared a meal together. Before there was a first kiss. Before he had even told her his middle name. 37 pages. Signed in triplicate. And she read every single word. Ironclad clauses, non-disclosure agreements, behavioral expectations written out like corporate policy, financial penalties for what he called emotional breach. He had given this document to women before her. He was very, very good at this. And every woman who had come before Diana had done one of two things. They had either walked away in disbelief, or they had quietly signed and tried to forget what they had just agreed to. Diana did neither. What he didn't know, what he never could have predicted, is that Diana didn't just read the document. She studied it. And the way a surgeon studies an X-ray before she makes the first incision, she read every clause, every footnote, every sub-paragraph that most people would have skimmed right over. And then, on page 22, between two sections he had barely given a second thought to, she picked up her pen. And she added something. 4 sentences, written by hand, in the margin. He initiated every page, including page 22. Stay with me, because by the time this story is over, you are not just going to be shocked. You are going to stand up and applaud. Her name was Diana Mercer. His name was Richard Cole. And this is the story of what happens when a man who spent his entire career writing contracts designed to protect himself from the people who loved him finally met the one woman who had read the fine print and quietly rewrote the ending. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what we are about to walk through together is the kind of story that makes you think twice about every agreement you have ever signed, and every person you have ever trusted to keep their word. Richard Allen Cole was 54 years old when he met Diana Mercer at a dinner party in Savannah, Georgia. By every outward measure, he was a man who had constructed a very impressive life. He had built one of the most recognized family law practices in the state. He drove a car that cost more than most people's first homes. He had been married twice and walked away from both marriages having kept most of what he entered them with. He had a reputation in Atlanta legal circles as a man who did not leave things to chance. Not in the courtroom, not in business, and certainly not in love. Diana Renee Mercer was 48 years old. She had spent the last 2 decades working as a social worker in Chatham County, Georgia, sitting across from some of the most broken-hearted people you could ever meet. People who had come to her after everything had already fallen apart. She had been married twice herself. The first marriage ended when she was 31. The second lasted 4 years before she discovered that the man she had trusted with her future had been building an entirely separate financial life she knew nothing about. And by the time Diana sat down across that dinner table from Richard Cole, she had learned a truth that most people only learn the hard way. Trust is not given. Trust is verified. Here are the 3 questions this story is going to answer. The first one is why any woman, especially a woman as sharp and self-possessed as Diana Mercer, would sign a document that so heavily favored the man sitting across from her. The second question is what exactly she wrote in that margin on page 22. 4 sentences, in her own handwriting, that Richard initiated without reading. What were they, and what did they change? And the third question, the one this entire story really comes down to, is who actually held the power when it all finally unraveled, and these 2 people were sitting across from each other with their attorneys and their histories and everything they had each been carrying in secret. If you think you already know the answer to that third question, hold on to that thought. Because the answer is going to surprise you. Diana Mercer grew up in Macon, Georgia, in a house where love and obligation were always spoken in the same sentence. Her father, James, was a postal worker and a man of fixed routines and firm principles. He kept a handwritten ledger of every household expense going back to 1971. He had a filed copy of every agreement he had ever made with a contractor, a neighbor, or a bank. When Diana was 10 years old, he sat her down at the kitchen table, slid a piece of paper across the wood surface, and said, "Read before you sign. Read it again before you believe it." She never forgot that. Her mother, Carol, was the counterweight in that house. Warm, expressive, the kind of woman who remembered every birthday and never missed a Sunday phone call. She loved her husband and her children with a completeness that Diana would spend years trying to replicate in her own relationships. And therein lay the complication. Diana had learned two things in that Macon house: to read everything carefully, and to want to be loved the way her mother loved. Those two instincts would, for most of her adult life, pull in opposite directions. She was a brilliant student, earned a scholarship to the University of Georgia, studied sociology, went on to get her master's degree in social work. She had offers to go into consulting, into policy work, or into several fields that would have paid her considerably more than the county salary she eventually accepted. But Diana went back home. She wanted to sit across from people in crisis and be useful. That was the word she always used: useful. Not successful, not powerful, useful. Her friends teased her about it. Her mother understood it completely. Her first marriage, to a man named Marcus, came when she was 29. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they are in pursuit of something, and considerably less so once they have secured it. The marriage lasted 2 years. It ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, devastating realization. Diana had been giving everything she had to a person who had never intended to give anything back. She filed the papers herself, and her father helped her read them. The second relationship, with a man named Paul, was more complicated because it lasted longer and hurt deeper. 4 years. She had chosen more carefully this time, or so she believed. Paul was steadier than Marcus, more responsible, at least on the surface. He talked about the future in concrete terms: a house, a daughter one day, a life they would build together. Diana believed him. She was, by her own admission in later years, desperately wanting to believe him. It was not until Paul's business partner called her one afternoon, thinking he was doing the right thing, that Diana discovered Paul had been running a second set of finances entirely separate from their joint accounts. He had been siphoning money for more than 2 years, planning, it appeared, for a future that did not include her. She did not cry when she found out. She went to her desk, opened a new file folder, and started writing everything down. That folder was not anger. It was not revenge. It was preparation. Diana Mercer had decided, after Paul, that she was done being the woman who arrived at the end of a story and found out she had been reading the wrong draft. If she was ever going to trust someone again, she was going to make absolutely certain she understood the terms first. Richard Cole's story was, in its own way, a mirror image of Diana's, but reflected through a completely different lens. He grew up in Columbus, Georgia, in a family that had once had money and had the old furniture to prove it, but had spent the last 2 generations quietly running out of it. His father was a proud man who refused to let anyone see the cracks in the ceiling. And his mother had worked as a secretary at a law firm for 20 years, and Richard had grown up watching her dress for an office that did not particularly value her, come home exhausted, and then cook dinner without complaint. He respected her for it, and he swore, very young, that he would never need anyone to sacrifice that way for him. Richard put himself through the University of Georgia on scholarships and part-time work, got into Emory Law School, graduated in the top 8% of his class, and clerked for a federal judge before joining a family law practice in Atlanta. He discovered almost immediately that he had a talent for the particular kind of coldness that family law requires, the ability to look at a marriage, at the wreckage of what had once been a life someone loved, and see it as a series of assets to be divided, liabilities to be assigned, and clauses to be enforced. Some people found this quality unsettling. His clients found it invaluable. His first marriage was to a woman named Carolyn, a marketing director he met at a bar association event. They were married for 9 years and had no children. The divorce was handled with the same efficiency Richard brought to his professional cases, with one notable exception. Carolyn later told friends that she had entered the marriage without any prenuptial agreement and had spent 3 years in litigation discovering exactly what that meant when the person across the table from you had drafted agreements for a living. She walked away with a settlement. Richard walked away having lost, by his own calculation, very little of what he had walked in with. His second marriage, to a colleague named Patricia, lasted 4 years. This time Richard came fully prepared. There was a prenuptial agreement, comprehensive, detailed, reviewed by 3 attorneys before Patricia signed it. She later said she had believed it was a formality. She was wrong. When that marriage ended, Richard walked away with his assets intact, his reputation undamaged, and a refined understanding of exactly where the leverage lived in a personal relationship. And he began to think about how to apply that understanding not just in marriage, but in the relationships that came before it. What Richard Cole created in the years between his second divorce and the night he walked into that dinner party in Savannah became known, among the people who eventually learned of it, as the Cole Agreement. It was 37 pages long. It had been revised and refined at least twice. A paralegal at his own firm who had reviewed it once described it privately as one of the most exhaustive personal relationship agreements she had ever seen. It covered, in extraordinary detail, the financial expectations of any romantic partnership with Richard, requiring the woman who signed it to disclose her full financial history going back 10 years, including every prior relationship that had any financial dimension. It included a non-disclosure provision, meaning that the person who signed it agreed not to discuss the nature of the relationship, the terms of the agreement, or any personal information shared during the relationship with any third party, including family members, for a period of 5 years following the conclusion of the relationship. There were behavioral clauses, there were communication schedules, and there was a section on what Richard called relational maintenance expectations, essentially a calendar of how often the couple was expected to discuss the state of the relationship and for how long, and with a suggested written agenda prepared by both parties in advance. It read less like a love document and more like a corporate acquisition agreement, but it was written in the measured, careful language of someone who understood exactly how documents were read, or not read, by people who were in love or who wanted to be. It used the word mutual 31 times. 4 women had signed the Cole Agreement before Diana. None of them had read it the way she did, and none of them had done what Diana did the night she sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water, a legal pad, And the 37 pages he had handed her over coffee that afternoon. She read it the way her father had taught her to read everything important. Slowly, twice, as if someone might hold it against her one day. And on page 22, in the language of clause 22b, she found something that Richard had almost certainly included as a formality. A standard legal placeholder that attorneys insert almost reflexively, because it protects agreements from being challenged on procedural grounds. The clause stated that either party retained the right to add written modifications to any section of the agreement provided such modifications were initialed by both parties at the time of signing. It was boilerplate. It was the legal equivalent of a door left open in a room the owner believed was empty. Diana read that sentence 3 times, and then she went to her kitchen drawer, found a fine-tip black pen, turned to page 22, and in the white space of the right margin, between clause 22b and clause 22c, she wrote 4 sentences. Carefully, precisely. In the handwriting of a woman who had spent 2 decades writing case notes in files that might someday be read by a judge? She wrote them the way her father had taught her to write everything that mattered, as if someone might hold them against her one day. When she was done, she signed at the bottom of the page, just below the margin note, and dated it. The next day, she brought the document back to Richard over coffee. He flipped to the signature page, confirmed her name was there, initialed each page as he went, including page 22, and tucked the document into his briefcase. He did not read her addition, and he would not read it for 8 more months. And in those 8 months, everything that happened between them was already playing out inside those 4 sentences she had written. He just did not know it yet. By any external measure, Richard Cole and Diana Mercer made a striking couple. He was polished and successful, witty in the specific way that men who have spent decades in courtrooms learn to be witty, always ready with the right observation at the right moment, always aware of how the room was reading him. She was warm and grounded in the way that people who spend their lives doing difficult, thankless work often are. Genuinely interested in other people, slow to impress, impossible to flatter with the usual tools. Their friends, particularly Richard's, thought he had finally found someone who could match him. And his colleague Thomas was overheard at a fundraising dinner saying that Diana was the first woman Richard had dated since his second divorce, who seemed entirely unbothered by him, and that this was clearly driving Richard wild in the best possible way. And for a time, Diana allowed herself to be genuinely present in the relationship. She enjoyed his company. She found his mind interesting. There were evenings over dinner where she laughed harder than she had laughed in years, and moments on weekend walks where she felt the particular warmth of being known by another person. She was not performing these feelings. They were real. But alongside the real feelings, Diana carried the knowledge of what she had written on page 22. And that knowledge did not make the warmth less genuine. It made her more attentive, more deliberate in how she watched him. Her daughter Maya, who met Richard twice during those 8 months, later described watching her mother at the dinner table during their first meeting. She said her mother was not nervous the way people usually are when they bring someone new home. She was watchful, like she already knew something the rest of them didn't. Richard, for his part, fell into the relationship with the confidence of a man who had designed the terms himself. He had the document. He had her signature. The mechanisms of control that he had spent years refining were all in place, and he used them, not dramatically, but consistently, in the way that people who use contracts as emotional architecture always find a way to use them. When Diana said something he disagreed with, he would sometimes say, gently but precisely, and that he thought they had covered something related to that in Section 14. When she was slow to respond to a message, he would remind her that Clause 8 addressed communication timelines. He said these things with a smile, but he said them, and Diana wrote each instance down in a notebook she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk at home. The cracks in Richard's architecture began to show around the 5th month, and they showed in the precise way that cracks in control always show, not dramatically, but as an accumulation of small moments that individually seem minor and collectively tell a story you cannot unread. The dinner with his colleagues in November, when he corrected Diana in front of 3 other attorneys on a point about Georgia family law, and Diana had been right. He, as the colleague who quietly checked the statute during the appetizers, could confirm. She did not say this at the table. She smiled, let it pass, and wrote it down when she got home. The argument about the weekend she had planned with her sister, which Richard had not been informed about in advance, which he framed calmly in the register of a man who is never shouting but is always pressing, as a failure to prioritize the relationship in the terms they had both agreed to. She listened. She did not argue. She opened her notebook. There was the evening he read a text on her phone that she had not offered to show him, and when she pointed this out, he cited Clause 11 as a basis for his belief that transparency in communication was a mutual expectation they had both signed. She looked at him for a long moment when he said that, not long enough that he added, with slightly less certainty, that he was simply clarifying the terms they had agreed to. She told him she understood. She did not tell him what she was actually thinking, which was that she had now documented 63 separate instances in 8 months of Richard Cole invoking a contract to justify behavior that the contract had been designed to normalize. She had a folder. It was organized chronologically. It had section dividers. Her father would have been proud of how neat it was. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November. Richard had come to Diana's house for dinner, and while she was in the kitchen, he found the folder. He had not been looking for it. Or perhaps, if you understand the way controlling people operate, he had always been looking for something, and in the quiet, almost unconscious way that people who believe they own the terms of a situation are always searching for confirmation that the terms are holding. He found it on her desk. He opened it, and he stood there in Diana Mercer's home office, reading his own behavior reflected back at him in the careful, precise handwriting of a woman who had been taking notes since their second date. And he felt something that Richard Cole had not felt in a very, very long time. He felt like the one who didn't know what was in the contract. The folder Diana kept was not a legal document. It was a personal record, the kind that social workers are trained to maintain, because in their line of work, memory alone is never sufficient. Every entry was dated. Every entry was specific. And every entry corresponded to a clause in the Cole agreement that he had, in Diana's well-documented assessment, violated. 63 entries over 8 months. Each one cross-referenced to the clause it reflected. Each one written in the measured, factual language of someone who understood that feelings are not evidence, and that evidence is what eventually matters. Clause 8, which required mutual respect in all forms of direct communication, appeared against 12 separate entries. Clause 15, which promised full emotional availability from both parties, appeared against entries describing 63 canceled plans, 51 of which had been canceled by Richard with less than 24 hours' notice. Clause 19, the relational maintenance schedule, he appeared against 7 instances in which Richard had either cut short or rescheduled the structured communication sessions that his own contract required. And Clause 31, which stated both parties would share equally in the burden of relationship maintenance, appeared against a general summary Diana had written at the bottom of the final section, in language notable for its restraint. Review of 8 months indicates asymmetrical application of agreement terms in all documented categories. Documentation complete. When Richard found the folder, his first response was the response of a man who had spent his career on the other side of exactly this kind of documentation. His face went still. He set the folder back precisely where he had found it. He returned to the kitchen, finished the dinner Diana had made, and carried himself through the rest of the evening with the composed professionalism of a man who was already calculating his next move. Diana, who had been watching him for 8 months and who had been waiting for this moment in a way she had never quite said aloud, noticed that his behavior during dessert was slightly different from usual. She described it later to her sister as a quiet that was doing too much work. She knew he had found it. She poured him coffee and asked how his day had been. He answered. They sat across from each other in the warm light of her kitchen, both knowing exactly what had just happened, neither one saying a word about it. And that, in its way, was the most honest moment they had ever shared. The following morning, Richard called his personal attorney, and a man named Gerald, who had been his colleague and trusted advisor for 15 years, and who had helped Richard navigate the legal end of relationships on at least 3 prior occasions with minimal exposure. Richard described the folder. Gerald listened. Then Gerald asked a question Richard had not anticipated: whether Diana had spoken to anyone about the agreement itself. Richard said he didn't believe so. The non-disclosure provisions were in place. Gerald said he needed Richard to tell him exactly what was in that folder, and whether there was anything in the original document that Diana could use. Richard said the document was airtight. He had drafted it himself. There was a pause on Gerald's end of the line that Richard later described, in the quiet of his own thoughts, as the kind of pause a doctor makes when deciding how to tell you something you are not going to want to hear. What Richard did not yet know, what he could not have known, was that the non-disclosure provisions he was relying on to contain this situation were no longer the provisions he had written. The document that existed in Diana's filing cabinet was not the document Richard believed he had created. It had been quietly, carefully, precisely modified by the woman he had handed it to, and then signed by both of them, in ink, with full legal validity. The door Diana had found in Clause 22b was not a metaphor. It was an amendment. And Richard Cole, who had spent his career writing contracts designed to protect him from exactly this kind of moment, had initialed it himself. And in the months between signing the agreement and that Thursday evening in November, Diana had done something else that Richard never anticipated. She had found the others, not all at once, and not easily, but with the patient, methodical persistence of a woman who had spent 20 years tracking down resources for people who needed help, and who had a particular talent for finding what other people couldn't. She had found 4 of them, 4 women in 4 different cities across Georgia and South Carolina, who had at various times in the previous decade sat down across from Richard Cole and signed some version of the Cole Agreement. She did not approach them as a group. She reached out to each one individually, introduced herself simply as a woman who had recently met Richard through a mutual acquaintance, and asked if they would be willing to talk. 3 said yes. 1 did not respond. Of the 3 who did, 2 had signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their settlements when their relationships with Richard ended. They spoke carefully, obliquely, in the way people speak when they know their words carry legal weight. But what they communicated, beneath the careful language, was consistent across all 3 conversations. Each of them had entered a relationship with Richard believing it was a partnership. Each of them had slowly discovered that the document they had signed was not a framework for a relationship. It was a framework for a managed transaction in which Richard held all the real leverage, and the language of mutuality was the cover story. One of them, a former schoolteacher from Macon, he told Diana near the end of their conversation that she had gone to 2 attorneys after her relationship with Richard ended, trying to understand whether her non-disclosure was enforceable. Both told her it was. She had not spoken about Richard publicly in 4 years. She said, very quietly, as they were wrapping up, that she just wished somebody had warned her. Diana wrote that sentence at the top of the last page of her notebook that night. She underlined it twice. At this point in the story, if you have spent any time watching courtroom dramas, or if you have, perhaps, lived through a difficult legal situation of your own, you are probably expecting what comes next to involve a lawsuit, a public filing, a deposition in which Diana sits across from Richard in a formal conference room and reads his own violations back to him while his attorney objects. It would have been satisfying. And Diana, who had a very well-organized folder and 20 years of experience navigating systems designed to protect themselves from the people they were supposed to serve, had certainly thought about it. But the lawsuit was never the plan. A lawsuit would have required revealing the folder publicly, which would have meant deposing the women Diana had spoken to, all 3 of whom were still bound by their own non-disclosures. It would have meant years of litigation and years of staying legally tethered to a man she had already decided she was done with. Diana had not built the folder to go to court. She had built it because she was her father's daughter, and because she understood with complete clarity that documentation is not always for a judge. Sometimes the most powerful thing evidence can do is simply be seen by the right person at the right moment. The real move had been made 8 months ago, in the margin of page 22. All that remained was for the right person to read it. What Diana did instead was reach out through a third-party mediator she had located through professional channels and request a formal meeting. Just the 2 of them, their attorneys, and the original signed copy of the Cole Agreement. The request was framed in the mediator's letter to Richard's office as a voluntary dispute resolution session regarding the terms and application of a personal agreement both parties had executed. Gerald reviewed the letter and told Richard there was no reason not to attend. The agreement was airtight. The non-disclosures were in place. Whatever Diana thought she had in that folder, the document protected him. Richard agreed to the meeting with the confidence of a man who had never once sat down at a negotiating table and lost. He came prepared. He had a written response to what he anticipated the folder represented. 14 points addressing each documented entry, framing each one within the precise language of the relevant clause. He had a counterclaim noting that Diana had on several occasions not adhered to the communication schedule in Clause 19. He had a legal brief summarizing the enforceability of the non-disclosure provisions. He brought 2 associates from his firm. He brought Gerald. And he wore the kind of suit that people wear when they want the room to understand immediately that they are the most experienced person in it. Diana came alone except for 1 attorney, a family law specialist named Patricia from Savannah, who had, as Gerald's firm later determined, an extraordinary record in mediation proceedings involving complex personal agreements. Diana carried a single manila envelope. She set it on the table when she sat down. She did not open it. She ordered coffee. She asked the mediator how the drive-in had been. She appeared, to every person in that room, to be the most relaxed individual present. Richard, watching her from across the table, felt the first faint edge of a thought he did not want to have. That Diana Mercer was not the least bit concerned about what was in his briefcase. and that maybe he should have read every page of the document he had been carrying in his. The mediator later said that in 30 years of practice, she had never watched a man's expression change the way Richard Cole's did when he turned to page 22 of his own contract and finally read what was written there. He read it once, quickly, the way people read things they don't believe they are reading. And then he read it again, slowly. And then he set the document down on the table, very carefully, and looked across at Diana Mercer. And she met his eyes with the expression of a woman who had been waiting, patiently and without anxiety, for exactly this moment. Here is what Diana had written in the margin of page 22, between clause 22b and clause 22c, in neat and perfectly legible handwriting. Clause 22c, addendum, the hand entered by undersigned party of the first part, pursuant to modification rights established in clause 22b. In the event that the party of the second part fails to uphold the mutual standards of respect, transparency, and equitable treatment outlined in this agreement, as documented by written record maintained by the party of the first part, the non-disclosure provisions of clauses 33 through 36 shall be rendered void and unenforceable with respect to the party of the first part only, and the party of the first part shall retain the right to disclose the contents of this agreement and any related documentation to any professional, personal, or civic party she deems appropriate, without restriction or penalty. She had signed it. She had dated it. Richard had initialed it. What Diana had done, in 4 sentences, he was attach a condition to the most powerful weapon in the Cole Agreement. The non-disclosure provision that had silenced 4 women before her was no longer absolute. It was conditional. And the condition was the one thing Richard had never imagined anyone would hold him to: his own terms. The moment the folder became necessary, Diana was free. Free to speak. Free to share. Free to tell every person who needed to know exactly what she knew and how she knew it. He had written the modification clause into his own document. She had simply used it. He had given her the key. She had kept it in her pocket for 8 months and waited for the right door. There is a particular quality to the silence in a room when someone has just understood something they cannot ununderstand. Gerald looked at page 22 for a long moment. Then he asked the mediator for a recess. During those 14 minutes in the hallway, he explained to Richard, quietly and with the directness of a long-trusted advisor, what the handwritten addendum meant in practical terms. It meant the document no longer protected Richard the way he believed it did. It meant the folder Diana had assembled, 63 entries, all cross-referenced, all dated, all meticulous, was no longer something she was legally prevented from sharing. It meant the 4 women who had believed they were permanently bound by their non-disclosures were now bound by agreements whose terms had just become considerably more complicated. And it meant that Diana Mercer, sitting across the hall with her coffee and her 1 manila envelope, was holding every card in the deck. Richard had spent his career building systems to protect himself. He had married twice and walked away from both with his assets and reputation intact. He had developed a document specifically designed to ensure that his personal relationships carried no more risk than his professional transactions. He had handed that document to a woman who, by every appearance, would simply read it, feel a little uncomfortable, and sign. He had been so certain of the architecture he had constructed, so certain that he had initialed 37 pages without reading the 1 paragraph that changed everything. And that paragraph had been sitting in his own briefcase, in a document he believed he controlled, for 8 months. When Richard and Gerald returned to the conference room, And the dynamic had changed in the way dynamics always change when information shifts irrevocably. Richard sat down. He looked across at Diana. She looked back. She did not say anything that could be interpreted as gloating. She did not appear to be savoring the moment. She was simply present. The same calm, deliberate presence she had brought to every moment of the past 8 months. Gerald indicated to the mediator that they were prepared to discuss the terms of a resolution. Diana's attorney said that was exactly why they were there. Diana picked up her coffee, held it in both hands, and placed the folder from the manila envelope in the center of the table. The discussion that followed lasted 4 hours. It was not a lawsuit. It was not a trial. At the end of it, Richard Cole signed a written acknowledgement, as part of the mediation record, that the terms of the Cole Agreement had not been applied equitably during the course of the relationship. The specific language had been negotiated carefully, but the acknowledgement existed, and it was signed. The addendum on page 22 had voided the non-disclosure provisions as they applied to Diana. But what about the 4 women who had come before her? Women who had signed their own versions of the Cole Agreement without the benefit of Diana's modification? This is where the story takes a turn that even Diana had not fully anticipated. Patricia, Diana's attorney, had drafted the language of the acknowledgement with a precision that reflected her years of experience in exactly these kinds of cases. And the acknowledgement did not address only Diana's situation. It addressed, in carefully worded but unmistakable terms, the pattern of conduct that the Cole Agreement represented. The systemic use of legal documentation to create the appearance of mutual protection, while concentrating real leverage in the hands of one party. 3 of the 4 women Diana had spoken to were contacted through their own attorneys in the weeks following the mediation. Each received a letter. The letters did not contain a full public disclosure of the mediation record, which remained private under the terms of the agreement. But each letter contained a formal acknowledgement that the non-disclosure agreement they had signed may have been, in the words of the letter, unequally applied in ways that warrant reconsideration of its terms. Each woman was given the option to enter a supplemental mediation process to address those terms. 2 chose to do so. The schoolteacher from Macon was one of the 2. She later said to a friend that the letter had made her cry, not from sadness, from the feeling of being, for the first time in 4 years, heard. Richard Cole did not lose his law license. He did not face criminal charges. He did not appear in a courtroom as a defendant. What he lost, in the months that followed the mediation, was something that a man like Richard Cole had perhaps valued more than any of those things. He lost his certainty. The certainty that he had built the perfect system. The certainty that he had anticipated every variable. The certainty that the document he had crafted, revised, and deployed with such consistency could not be turned against him. And it had been turned against him, not through litigation, not through public exposure, not through any of the mechanisms he had spent his career preparing to defend against. It had been turned against him by a woman who had simply read the whole thing. 3 months after the mediation, on a Sunday morning in February, Diana Mercer's phone rang. She was in her kitchen. Her daughter Maya was at the table with a cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle. Diana looked at the screen. It was Richard. She walked to the other room. Maya could hear only Diana's side of the conversation, which was mostly silence with a few short responses. When Diana came back to the kitchen, she sat down across from her daughter, without speaking immediately. Maya looked at her. Diana looked at the crossword puzzle. Then she said, very quietly, that he wanted to meet for coffee. Maya put down her pen and looked at her mother for a long time. Then she said, "Mom, what do you want to do?" Diana thought about it. She said she thought she wanted to go. She went on a Tuesday. They met at the same cafe where he had first handed her the envelope 9 months earlier. Diana arrived first and ordered a coffee and sat with it in both hands the way she always did when she was thinking. Richard arrived a few minutes later. He sat down. He had nothing with him, no briefcase, no legal pad. He looked, by Diana's account, like a man who had made a decision to stop performing. He said hello. She said hello. He ordered coffee. And then he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need to ask it without an attorney present." Diana said, "All right." He said, "How did you know? How did you see it that clearly, from the beginning, when no one else ever did?" Diana held her coffee in both hands. She thought about all the ways she could answer that question. She thought about her father and the kitchen table in Macon. She thought about Marcus and the 2 years she had given to a man who had never intended to give anything back. She thought about Paul and the 4 years she had given to a man who had been building a separate life in the margins of their shared one. She thought about 20 years of sitting across from people in crisis, watching what happened after the agreements had broken down. She thought about the teacher from Macon, who had said she just wished somebody had warned her. And she thought about page 22. She said, "Richard, and I have spent my entire career sitting with people after everything has fallen apart. After the betrayals, after the failures, after the documents turned out to mean something different than they were supposed to. I have watched what happens to people who confuse control with love. And I recognized your agreement the moment I read it, not as love, and not even as protection, as fear. You were afraid of being left with nothing again. You were afraid of being the person who got exactly what he deserved, and so you built a system to make sure that could never happen. And I signed it because I understood exactly what it was. I signed it because I wanted you to know that someone had read the whole thing. What Richard Cole did in the weeks after that Tuesday morning is not the ending that anyone who knew his history would have predicted. And he did not file a counter-motion. He did not attempt to challenge the mediation agreement through the courts. He wrote letters, handwritten, personal, not through attorneys, not through a mediator. He wrote to the 2 women who had entered supplemental mediation. He wrote to the woman who had not responded to the initial letter. He wrote to Carolyn, his first wife. He wrote to Patricia, his second. The letters were not legal documents. They did not request anything. They did not offer anything in exchange for anything. They were, as near as the people who received them could tell, simply acknowledgments. An acknowledgment that the systems he had built had caused harm, and that the language of fairness he had used in his documents had not reflected the reality of the relationships they governed. Whether those letters were enough, whether a letter, however sincere, can undo the specific harm of years of silence, or of a settlement that left someone feeling diminished, or of the particular kind of loneliness that comes from having signed away your right to speak about what happened to you, is a question that only the people who received them can answer. The teacher from Macon said, when asked about hers, that she read it twice. She said she was not sure what she felt. She thought she believed it. She said that believing it was not the same as being all right, but that it was something. She kept the letter in her desk. She did not frame it, but she did not throw it away. Diana received her letter. She read it. She said, 3 times. Just like the contract. This is a story about a contract. 37 pages of careful, a deliberate, expertly crafted language that a man used to try to manage the terms of love, or whatever he had decided was close enough to love that it would do. And it is a story about what happened when a woman who had spent her whole life learning to read between the lines encountered a document written by someone who believed that the lines were all that mattered. But more than any of that, it is a story about a thing that is older and more human than any contract ever written. It is a story about what we do when we are afraid, about the walls we build, the clauses we insert, the conditions we attach to the things we are most terrified of losing, about the way we try to protect ourselves from vulnerability by putting the terms of it in writing. Richard Cole built his system because he had been hurt, and he had decided, at some point, and that the solution was to make certain it could not happen again. He was not unique in this. He was simply more literal about it than most people. Most of us do not draft 37-page agreements before we allow ourselves to love someone. But most of us have our own version of the document, our own set of terms and conditions and non-disclosure provisions, the things we will not say, the parts of ourselves we will not share, the lines we will not cross until someone has proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that they are safe. Richard's version was just written down. The rest of us keep ours in our heads. And the thing Diana understood, the thing she tried to explain to Richard over coffee that Tuesday morning, is that the most dangerous thing you can do in any relationship is assume the other person has not read the fine print of who you really are. She had read his, every word, including the parts he had not meant to leave in. Diana Mercer still works as a social worker in Chatham County, Georgia. She still keeps a legal pad on her kitchen table. Her daughter Maya graduated from Georgia Southern last spring, and Diana went to the ceremony alone and cried the full, uncomplicated tears of a mother who is proud and who has worked very hard and who has chosen, after everything, to remain a person who believes that people are capable of change. She told her sister on the drive home that she still believes in agreements, so she just knows now that the most important ones are never the ones other people write for you. They are the ones you write yourself. Now, before you go anywhere, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. We genuinely love knowing where our community is, and we have people watching from all across the United States and all over the world. Let us know you were here. And if you have not already hit that subscribe button, please do it now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because we have something coming very soon that is going to stop you in your tracks. It involves a woman who did not add a secret clause to a contract. She added a secret identity. And the man whose entire life she upended had absolutely no idea who she really was, until the day he hired her as his personal attorney. You will not want to miss that one. Thank you for spending this hour with Diana's story. Stories like hers matter, not because they are extraordinary, but because they are, in so many quiet ways, not. They are the stories of people who are trying to figure out how to love carefully in a world that has already hurt them once or twice. They are the stories of people who read the fine print because someone once sat them down at a kitchen table and told them to. And they are, in the end, stories about the kind of person you decide to be when you finally understand that no contract, however carefully written, however many pages long, however many times revised, can ever substitute for the thing it was always trying to replace. Take care of yourselves. We will see you in the next one.